I would be interested, we talked a lot beforehand, before I had seen it, about your process. And I'm impressed by your interest in the actor's process as a costume designer, and in the ways that you tried to design it all ahead of time and then redesign it along the way, and how you bring those things in. So I would actually be curious to hear about that part of it now that I've seen that. Maybe hear you reflect on where the hardest place, like those conversations with some of your two actresses who were very strong, like where were the hard places? Where did you come, now that I've seen it, where were the places, some specific places where maybe that came through, or decisions that you made, or where do you see some examples of that?
Well, I had learned sort of prior to this production that kind of no matter how good the quality of the design is, if you don't have a trust and a rapport and you can't communicate it with your actor, it'll just simply never look right. So it was always at the root of my process to make sure that specifically Tracy and Erica knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I made a point of saying, I think in our first read-through, like ask me about it. Like I didn't put a wristwatch on, I don't know, bad example, but I didn't put anything there because I just felt like it. I had a purpose, and you could totally disagree with it, but then we have to disagree with it and come to a new resolution on it. Or you can agree with it and we can run with it. But either way, I knew I needed them on my team. And I think the sort of best example of having to have that discussion was with Tracy over her kind of half change coming back in Act 2. And her initial response was...
I'm sorry, Tracy was...
She was Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you.
And she comes out initially in the kind of the suit jacket with the ruffle.
Yes.
And then later she comes back for a conversation with Lester, and she's just in sort of a shirtwaist. Tracy's sort of first thought was like, well, I'm Queen Elizabeth, I would never do that. I'm never wearing that thing. And I think both of us talked to her about it being a more intimate scene with Lester, that they kind of have this moment where they come together and, you know, and he does rub her shoulders and he does sort of gaze at her, and they do kind of have this romance that they play out of sight from everyone. And I never felt like you could sort of play it, sweet kisses and romance, with a collar up to here, that there had to be a more intimate look to have that more intimate scene, and to allow him to kind of, you know, put his moves on her, for lack of a more historical term. He's, you know, things are malleable in that scene, and, you know, that collar, there's nothing malleable about it. And I think if I had said, you're wearing this, it just would have been horrible. She would have looked weird.
Was that idea in place all along, that she would have that layer underneath and take her jacket off?
Yeah, it was part of the original rendering. But after we had the conversation, she saw that, and I think it gave her an opportunity to understand the costume, and me an opportunity to, you know, talk about it positively, and have that conversation with you as well.
Yeah, I mean, it all sort of came out too of working her opening moment into that scene as well, and how just the tone switches. So that's what we talked about.
Okay. Because you sort of repeat that later, right, with her next costume? She has a very similar shift.
And I mean, that came from the reality of like, well, what do you wear after someone tries to assassinate you? And there was a lot, that question came up a lot of times, like, what does a queen wear in jail? Like, there is no Google link for that. Like, what does a queen wear after someone's tried to kill her? Also, no Google link. So I often found myself in this predicament of, like, not having readily available research and having to, like, invent.
But you never have readily available research. And this is, I guess, my point, is when it comes to this idea, which is so interesting to me, to see how you've, sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
How you invent a world is you have to understand that's what we're actually doing.
Yes.
We're not actually putting Queen Elizabeth on the stage. We're not actually putting Mary Stuart on the stage. And there will never be a link. For that, and goddamn Google, right? Before that, I don't know, when I was a student, we'd have to trudge around knowing that there was no link, and you'd have to kind of, you know, based on your experience and your research and your reading and your understanding, you begin to make that up. But we're making up a world here. We're doing that every time, even if it's a historical drama. So that, I think, is an interesting question to really think about and to understand as artists, as students, as teachers, whatever we do, how we do that. That's the act. So, yeah.
I actually don't think I didn't have that lesson when we started. And I think Rob kind of beat it into me. And it was only kind of halfway through that I was so sort of possessed by the rules of the design process. Like, do your research and then draw those things and then draw the seam lines on the working drawings, and I kind of got paralyzed by that reality. And it was only later when I think you said something like, well, why can't she just have a bustle and she just not? It was like, I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. And then the reality of like creating a world for these characters to go through this in kind of dawned on me, and I was like, and that was empowering. Then I could, you know, pull a shirtwaist and be confident in it.
Good learning process. That's great. How is it different? I'm curious to know how it's different for the women. You've built a lot more of the women's costumes, and I think that one of the other challenges in this, just technically speaking, is the pulling together of pulled pieces and rented pieces and built pieces and altered pieces. That's just technically a costume designer challenge.
Yes.
So I'm curious, and I think that it seems clear you got to build a lot more of the women's pieces than you could of the men's, and so how were those experiences different?
Yeah.
That learning curve, that journey you just took?
The rental process presented pretty much every hurdle it could have, from having interesting body types to fit to reliable rental sources saying no, and then to fighting, getting something and then fighting the fit because it's difficult to alter menswear and make it sort of perfect. I did feel like the thing I had going for me was we had talked in early days about kind of like the wall of men, that there were all of these men manipulating these women. And so to have a distinction between men and women, and the women to feel a little bit more custom and a little bit more tailored, and the men to kind of feel like they all kind of came from a similar sort of men's warehouse place. It was like, okay, that's okay, they're all up to the same thing. But these women, they're different and they're unique. So that I kind of had that going for my advantage. But yeah, I rape and pillage. I rape and pillage every rental house available, I think.